We're joined in the studio with Dr. Phil Stinson from Bowling Green University. And Dr. Stinson has done extensive research on police shootings and police criminal behavior. And he has compiled a database. And I would say that his data is probably at the cutting edge of this particular subject matter, especially since there's never was a national database that officially collected this data. So Dr. Stinson took it upon himself to amend that. And so he can talk about the creative way he came up with to do that and about what some of the research he has uncovered. It's certainly a huge topic today, and I'm sure Dr. Stinson has been a very busy man being asked by all kinds of national news outlets about his research. So welcome, Dr. Stinson.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So your research about the topic of police shootings, when did it started in graduate class, I believe. You got the idea in a graduate class.
Yeah, so I had been a police officer for several years. I went to law school, practiced law for about a decade, and imploded professionally and personally. Decided I needed to make some changes. Thought I'd live a lot longer if I wasn't a litigator, and decided to get a PhD in criminology. So on the way to that, none of the PhD programs I was looking at was at all interested in the fact that I had a law degree. They wanted to see a master's degree before they would accept me into a PhD program or even consider me. So I was thinking about that and decided to enroll in a master's program where you teach at Westchester University of Pennsylvania in 2003. And I think that's when I met you. It was probably the fall of 2003. And the issue came up actually in an ethics class a year later in the fall of 2004. It was a class that Professor Diane Williams taught. And it came up in that class in terms of whether there was much police misconduct and specifically whether officers got arrested much. And most of my classmates, most of them were mid-level somewhere in the criminal justice system. They were career probation officers, police officers, a variety of things, all kinds of people. Some were young people right out of undergrad and starting their masters, but nobody in the class seemed to think that this was much of a problem. And I thought, well, you know what? I think by class a week from now, I can come up with a whole bunch of examples of officers who've been arrested just in the past week since our last class. So I set out to figure out a way to do that and figured out very quickly several things. One, the federal government did not and does not collect data on this type of thing. They certainly don't aggregate it and make it available in any way. It's a hidden type of crime. It's a type of crime that frankly we don't talk about in polite company. So I decided to set up some Google alerts. And at the time that was sort of a new thing, but I was interested in setting up some automated search terms that constantly crawled the Google News search engine. So not the Google search engine, but the search engine that drives traffic to the Google News page. And within a few days, had a whole handful of articles and news stories about officers from across the country who'd been arrested in the past few days, and marched into class the next week and presented this to my classmates. And ultimately, I set up 48 Google alerts, and those are still the same 48 Google alerts that I use to find cases of officers who've been arrested. So now, 17 or so years later, I have a research staff of about a dozen research assistants, undergraduate students, master's level grad students, and PhD students who work with me here at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. In the summer, we have 10. Each of them work about 30 hours a week. So it's a lot of moving parts. And we find about 1,100 cases each year across the country where sworn law enforcement officers, so non-federal officers, so that would be state troopers, deputy sheriffs, police officers, could even be a game warden, are arrested for all sorts of crimes. And to date, since I've started this data collection, I started January 1st, 2005 is what I started in terms of formal data collection for what became my PhD dissertation that I finished in 2009 and the work that I still do today. We've got well over 17,000 cases since 2005 in my database, in our internal database. of officers across the country who've been arrested for one or more crimes. And we've made 10 years of that data publicly available through the Henry A. Wallace Police Crime Database, which you can find at policecrime.bgsu.edu. 10,287 cases from 2005 through 2014. We're just next week adding another year's worth of data to the Henry A. Wallace Police Crime Database, and we'll have just under 12,000 cases involving about 10,000 officers, where we've made data available, or will have made data available at the end of next week when we add that extra year of data. So in a nutshell, that's the data collection. More specifically as to shootings, since Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri in August of 2014, there's been a heightened media attention starting right after that and going through to right now, frankly, on officers involved in on-duty shootings where somebody is fatally shot. So I keep track of the officers who are charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting. And I, off the top of my head, since 2005, I think we're now at 115 officers who've been charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting. And to date, only 42 of those officers have actually been convicted of a crime.
So what percent are usually not indicted in such cases?
Well, that used to be an impossible question to answer because, the United States Department of Justice and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention both would tell you that in an average year, a typical year, between 300 and 400 times, persons are shot and killed by on-duty police officers. I knew all along that was a gross underestimation of the number. And I worked with the Washington Post in developing their database since 2015. They've been actually the on-duty shootings database with that number 115 since 2005. Actually, in April of 2015, that was 54. And it was a joint research project I did with the Washington Post. They won the Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2016 for that project. And I helped give them some ideas to set up their database project where they now count all the cases where people are shot and killed by on-duty police officers across the country. And unfortunately, it's exactly what I thought. It's between 900 and 1,000 times each year on-duty police officers shoot and kill someone. In recent years, it's not going down. It's about 1,000 times each year. So of that, it's only a handful of times. We got about 1,000 times a year we have one of these fatal shootings with an on-duty officer. And since 2005, it's somewhere between 0 and 18 officers are charged. So I'd have to take a look at the numbers. They're actually in front of me here. This year, the running count we have, 6 officers have been charged so far this year. Last year it was about 12. So, and the year before that, 10. So we're right about where I would anticipate. It's really interesting because the laws of statistics really seem to apply here. Not only do we see a fairly static number each year, about 1,000 times each year on-duty police officers shoot and kill someone, but it's only about a dozen or a dozen and a half times each year where an officer is actually charged with murder or manslaughter in one of those cases. So the fact of the matter is that most on-duty police shootings, the officer is found to have been legally justified in using deadly force, right or wrong, but that's the result of investigation. So most officers do not face charges in these cases.
So out of all them shootings, what percentage of the shootings are African American or Latino?
Well, I don't have that number in front of me, but I can tell you that there's been a lot of talk about that in the media the last few days, where because President Trump said something which was just absurd about, well, black or white people are shot and killed by the police as well, but more white people are shot and killed, but the rate is much higher for blacks. In other words, it's much more likely that a black would be shot and killed by a police officer than a white person. And the reason for that, and this will come as no surprise to you, but most police officers, many police officers have a fear of black men and black boys. And that is the core value of the police subculture that's at the heart of what people, colloquially refer to as institutional racism. It's a fear of black men and black boys. And that's at the heart of all this with police officers.
And if you know, what percentage of black officers, if there's any, have committed these shootings on black or Latino men?
Yeah. I don't have that stat in front of me, but I have it available. And we actually do see that. We have a number of cases where African American black officers have shot and killed a black or a white person, and been charged for it, been charged with murder or manslaughter. And what seems to be going on there is that, the same values of the police subculture that the white officers assimilate, the socialization process works the same way for the black officers. They're more police officer than they are black at times, if you will, in terms of the way that they respond in dealing with other individuals on the street. In their encounters with black men and black boys on the street, they act like other police officers do, quite frankly, much of the time.
I mean, in your opinion, why do you think that George Floyd's murder has struck a chord with many Americans across the nation?
I think with George Floyd, we all look at that video, and it's just so shocking and upsetting to watch the man be choked out and killed, where Derek Chauvin, the officer, has a blank face, a flat affect. He's just seemingly willfully, gleefully killing him. And I think that, if we were to go into various neighborhoods in North Philly or West Philly, people will tell you that these things go on all the time. They can point out the houses where somebody lived who got killed by the police. But you know what? There's a lot of people across the country where, these have all seemed so abstract before. But when we saw that video, enough is enough. And people watched that, and they're starting to realize, no matter, where they're from, white, black, whatever, whatever their socioeconomic status is, they're starting to realize, well, you know what? This does happen, and this can't be explained. And people are starting to realize that they know people that this has happened to. You'd be amazed. People have walked up to me at airports to take me aside and tell me about a relative who was shot and killed. A woman, an older woman, took me aside at a pharmacy in the city that I live in Ohio a few years ago, and wanted me to know about her son-in-law who was shot and killed by a police officer. It happens way too often, and it's hit a nerve, because not only with the shootings, but maybe my mother would have a hard time understanding the fact that people get their ass kicked by police officers. But now people of all walks of life are saying, you know what, I actually know somebody who had told me that these kinds of things happen, and I've seen it enough that I realize this actually happens. What people in urban communities can tell us happens, people of all walks of life are now seeing as these are real issues. This does happen, and the policing system is broken. And most interestingly, one of the things we've seen in the last 6 weeks or so with the protests across the country, you might be interested in knowing, it's not just in center city Philadelphia, in the large cities where we're seeing this. They're actually recurring protests in small towns, in rural areas, all across the country, all across the Midwest. I've actually driven through small towns in Northwest Ohio and seen protesters, with signs of Black Lives Matter just in the last 6 weeks. Something that you'd never seen these types of things in these rural communities before in such an outspoken and obvious way. It's hit a curve. It's hit a chord with people because it's believable. And it's just not the abstract anymore. Freddie Gray, people outside of the cities people just didn't get it, and they're starting to get it. So I don't know that we've reached a tipping point, though, in terms of whether reforms are really going to take hold in terms of policing reforms. But to your question, people everywhere and of all political persuasions are realizing these are not isolated incidents. This stuff happens every day to people across the country. And but for the videos from people's smartphones, we wouldn't know anything about it.
In the last 6 weeks, we've been hearing about defunding the police. And I got mixed feelings about that, because I am a person that lived in urban community. I am a person that at one time in life was in the street life, but today I am a regular citizen, and I have, mixed feelings about defunding the police. I'm wondering, what is your professional opinion when you hear defunding the police?
Well, I think it's an interesting discussion to have as to many things that police departments do across the country now. Are they really the right people to be doing the task? But I do know if your mother or your sister were to be the victim of violent crime and they call 911, we want somebody to respond quickly. There are times we need law enforcement, right? So I don't know how we can just simply abolish policing and move forward. But I do think that there are many things that police departments do that maybe there are other agencies that should be doing them. Maybe we need to go back and rethink the fact that with deinstitutionalization of the mental health system, that our jails have become de facto mental hospitals across the country. You look at the large number of people who are pretrial detainees in county jails, and so many of them are mentally ill people that aren't getting the right treatment that they need. So the system's broken. I'm with you. I got mixed feelings about it, but I don't know what the right answer is. But I do think the fact that these discussions are going on is a good start.
We had a guest on a show a few months ago who's a local police officer official, and he does de-escalation, specifically mentally ill, and he's specially trained, and he trains other officers, but that training is not mandatory. And I think that's one of the problems. It's very inconsistent where it's offered and who takes advantage of it. And I think it's very effective because he demonstrated how he's able to de-escalate situations that could have ended tragically, and he was able to diffuse them.
With mental health issues, though, there are county mental health agencies across the country that have gone bankrupt. Providers, it's just the system, the mental health system, community mental health system is broken, and we've thrown it onto the police to respond to deal with mental health crisis intervention, and they're just not they're not equipped for the job. And it's an interesting point you make that some officers receive special training in de-escalation, dealing with mental health issues, and others don't. A good example of it's really amazing how broken the system is. Bob Dylan was right. Everything is broken.
I wanted to ask something else I wanted to mention, Phil, or ask you about. In those cases where officers are indicted, how unlikely convictions are, and the reluctance of juries and or judges to convict, that there's a large more latitude given to officers, benefit of the doubt, whatever, that general public would not get. If you or I were in a situation and we shot somebody, we would be convicted. And then you look at a police officer doing it in very similar circumstances, and they get a pass because of the stress of the job, because of the life or death and all these other kinds of things, spur of the moment, all enter into the decision making, and you see a great reluctance for consequences of serious notes to be passed on to them. Is that what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see it, as you mentioned, both in jury trials and then in bench trials. In fact, when we look at the data with the officers, the 115 officers who've been charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting since 2005, just over 15 years, we've seen no cases in a bench trial where an officer was convicted. We've got, I can't remember if it was 6 or 9, where we've had bench trials and they've all been acquitted. So it's really interesting. It could be there's something about those cases that are unique as to why the defense attorneys wanted a bench trial to begin with. But, I think some of the same phenomena are at play there that we see with juries. So no matter what a prosecutor does in terms of putting on their evidence, presenting expert testimony, presenting the legal standard on when an officer is justified in using deadly force, and it's a standard of objective reasonableness, what a reasonable police officer in that situation would have done without the benefit of hindsight. Even so, somehow when you get the jurors in the jury deliberation room, they twist it on its head and they make it a subjective standard. And by the way, if an officer subjectively believes that there was an imminent threat that would entitle them to use just deadly force, but if that subjective belief was objectively unreasonable, then their actions were not legally justified and potentially criminal. But we see it over and over again when the juries get into the deliberation room, when the jurors are thinking about this. They seem to be very reluctant to second guess the split second decisions of on duty police officers in potentially violent street encounters. And this is even more so when an officer takes the witness stand in their own defense at a trial, expresses remorse, and says, I did it because I had to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I believe that I needed to do it to save my life. What we see with the jurors is they just seemingly completely disregard, the evidence that's beyond a reasonable doubt at trial, and they simply they nullify. They just aren't going to return a guilty verdict, or some jurors aren't, and you end up with a hung jury with a mistrial. So over and over and over again. So I've been asked in the last month or so numerous times, well, have we reached the tipping point? Our jurors going to look at this differently now? And I don't know. I don't know that that's going to be the case, because people want to believe that police are the good guys, and most of the time they are, and they just aren't willing to convict. They say, you know what, I could imagine myself in that situation, or my daughter's a police officer. I can imagine her in that situation. I just don't want to second guess the officer. They just aren't going to return a verdict. And we see this in cases, frankly, where there's video evidence that's damning, that prosecutors think it's a slam dunk, and frankly, prosecutors aren't used to going to trial. As you know, 95% or more of cases don't end in a jury trial or any trial. They end in a guilty plea. So it's the show trials here. And prosecutors sometimes seem to let their guard down in these cases where there's strong video evidence. They still got to prove each and every element of each offense charge beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mm-hmm. Other crimes I'm like to explore a little bit. We talk about domestic violence, and in some statutes, people that own firearms, lose their right to have a firearm in domestic violence cases. Right. When you have a police officer accused of domestic violence, they're making the argument, they can't work unless they have this ability to have a firearm. So, and you've seen cases where they're allowed to plead to some lesser offense, so that they don't fall into the category of domestic violent offender. Have you seen results or seen examples of this?
Oh, yeah. So under the Lautenberg Amendment to the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968, any person who's convicted of what they call a qualifying misdemeanor crime of domestic violence cannot possess or own firearms or ammunition. So if we have a police officer who is convicted of simple assault and the victim is their wife, under federal law, they are barred from carrying a firearm. They cannot work as a police officer in this country because our police officers are armed, even though it's a misdemeanor conviction. So, we see it over and over again where police officers are given preferential treatment in terms of the charging decision as to what charges are brought against them formally once they're arrested in a domestic violence case, and also in terms of a plea bargain. So I'll give you one example. This is actually a true example, although it'll seem absurd. There's a case that we have in our database out of a small village in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, so just east of the city of Cleveland, where an officer was charged with a domestic violence crime. And the plea was to unlawful possession of an alligator. Well, for unlawful possession of an alligator, even if that is a misdemeanor conviction in the state of Ohio, that's not a qualifying misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. So that officer was able to keep his gun and badge and continued to work several more years before leaving the police department of his own volition and moving to Florida. And we've seen many examples like that. So officer-involved domestic violence is a huge problem. It's a scary proposition for victims of domestic violence and law enforcement families to even call the police because they're not sure if one of their buddies is going to show up. They're not sure what the outcome is. It's also terrifying. Think of it if you have someone who's the victim, their spouse or their significant other is a police officer, and they're worried about child support and stability of the family. If the officer loses their job, then there's no money to pay the bills. So it's a complicated issue, but it's something that I've researched a lot and I talk about a lot and I've written about a lot because it's important. One of the goals of my research is to improve policing, and that includes trying to reduce the incidence and prevalence of officer-involved domestic violence. But before we can do that, we have to acknowledge that it's a problem at many of the more than 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies across the United States. And it is a problem. And there are some examples in my database where there are officers who are still employed today as police officers that have been convicted of qualifying misdemeanor crimes of domestic violence. There still is not a really good system to police that, to make sure that someone who's been convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor is not working in law enforcement. It's a huge problem.
There's also a phenomenon too of the so-called gypsy cops, folks that have been fired for serious problems. The officer that killed Tamir Rice, he had an incident at a firing range and got fired from another department, but he migrated to this other department, got hired. And at the firing range incident, when he got fired, they said he shouldn't work as a police officer. It was inappropriate behavior, or over the top. So here you have somebody that able to move on from that and still get another policing job, and ends in a disastrous response. So the so-called Gypsy Phenomenon, where these problem cops are able to move around without a record following them, I don't quite understand how this is possible.
Well, here's what happens. So, a lot of times an officer who's a problem officer is given the opportunity to resign from his or her job at a police department or sheriff's office. They simply want them to go away. They want to get rid of the problem. So they oftentimes are allowed to resign in lieu of a internal investigation even being completed. And they're often allowed the opportunity to resign in lieu of criminal charges being initiated. So in those cases, they don't even get into my database. They never get on my radar. We never learn about those cases. So, but it's interesting. I did a joint research project with the Wall Street Journal several years ago, where we took 3,400 names from my database of officers who had been arrested, and then they were either convicted and or they lost their job as a result of the arrest. And we spent a year and a half gathering up lists of sworn officers from states across the country. Ended up with a list of 875,000 names. Not an easy task because there's no one central place to go. A few states don't even have such a list. They don't keep certifications of officers. And we ran the two lists against each other. And what we found was exactly 10% of the officers in my database that we had on the list of officers who'd been arrested and then convicted and or arrested and then lost their job. We found 10% of those officers, 340 of them, were again or still working as a sworn law enforcement officer. Sometimes in different places, different states. We found a police officer from Florida. A condition of her resolution of her criminal case was she would give up her certification to be a police officer in Florida and not work as a law enforcement officer anymore. We found her working as a deputy sheriff in Richmond, Virginia. Much to her dismay, I think, that we found her. We found officers who had been at numerous agencies. There's an officer in South Jersey, southern New Jersey, a few weeks ago who was arrested at Woodland, New Jersey. He's only in his early 30s, but it was his 9th agency in the state that he had worked at. 9. How do you pull that off in a decade as a police officer? Wow. Well, because you're a problem officer. And the reason this happens is because, especially with small agencies, they don't want to spend the money to send somebody to the recruit police academy. They don't want to hire somebody and have them on payroll and have to send them to the academy. They want to hire somebody who's already got the academy completed and the state level certification. So they generally are anxious to do this and will overlook some of their past. They don't even ask the questions, or they will look at the pattern of misconduct and actually somehow conclude, well, this was an aggressive officer. That's exactly the kind of officer we want here. Somebody who's on the ball and acting, aggressively on the job and very productive, writing a lot of tickets, making a lot of arrests, and they go ahead and hire them. And then the process just starts over again because they get in trouble again. So that's what's at play. There's been some federal legislation that's been, it's not going to go anywhere at the federal level because there's really no way for the feds to manage this. But we've seen several states, including the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, with legislation recently to look at that. However, it's a confidential database that Pennsylvania is setting up. It's only for law enforcement agencies. It'll only be for in-state law enforcement agencies to look at. And the same thing will continue, though, that's happened for years, and that's that officers will escape ever getting into that database because they'll be allowed to resign in lieu of investigations even being conducted or completed. So it's not going to solve the problem. It may slow it down a bit, but it's not going to fix the problem. It just isn't.
So let me ask you a question. What can the people that feel brutalized and traumatized by the police do to protect themselves when they come across an abusive officer? We know that when you go to internal affairs, it most of the time don't go nowhere. What can they do in today's time?
Well, part of the problem is that the police own the narrative, right? So it's the police version of events. So in the past, we've seen citizen complaints are dismissed because they say, well, it's uncorroborated. We can't find another witness who corroborates the complainant's allegations, and the officers made his or her statement. So we're going to go with that, and we're just going to close it out. You get no results at all, right, in those situations. So what we're seeing, though, is that video evidence is changing that, because what people are realizing is that some police officers routinely lie, that they make false statements in their police reports, in their incident reports, in their arrest reports, in their testimony in court. It's an open secret in the criminal justice system, in the criminal courts, testifying in terms of perjury by police officers. So I think technology will help in some of these cases where officers who are wrongly accused, they're helped by body-worn camera video recordings, quite frankly.
Mhm.
But it's the citizen smartphone videos that are making a difference, that are allowing for an alternative narrative to come out, to tell a side of the story that's simply been dismissed or not treated with any level of seriousness before. But the problem is, if somebody you can't video record the police if it's going to put you in harm's way. That's the problem. So it's not an easy task.
And how many states is it legal in every state to film police officers?
No. In fact, I would argue you have a First Amendment right to film officers in public. So I don't know if there's any state that actually claim that you can't. I know Pennsylvania has pretty draconian laws in terms of audio recordings, but no, most places you can video record the police in public.
Okay.
I wanted to also ask about something else, which is whistleblowing. And I'm thinking like a case in Chicago, Laquan McDonald, in which, was like an execution basically on the street. 16 shots fired at this individual that was killed. And there was many other police officers at the scene. And the video evidence is pretty clear of what happened. The police report says that the suspect was moving toward the officer that fired. He was not. Matter of fact, the officer moved toward him when he shot, and that was the basis of the conviction. All the other officers at the scene, they swore to the same thing. In other words, They lied about what had occurred. They basically said that this victim had aggressively gone after the police officer, and he had not. And all of those reports, there was a second, I guess, attempt to bring that to justice because of the officers that had perhaps fabricated the reports. And the judge decided that there was no need to do that, that they were all exonerated of any responsibility. I don't know how that's possible because they were on the scene. Their report obviously is not the same as what occurred in the video, right? So the whole idea of whistleblowing and loyalty to a false narrative of what occurred, this is highly problematic. And I think the other problem is there's no safe space for whistleblowers to come forward.
That's true. In
Departments
fact,
have
in,
not
in
made
law
it
enforcement
available.
agencies, they'll be shunned if they
Right.
come forward.
So all this talk of reform is not going to do much unless there's an actual mechanism by which people can do interventions and they can do the right thing without fears of repercussion. They don't have those in place. I don't think any department does. So to me, that's sort of putting the cart before the horse, because you don't have that mechanism in place yet. You can't expect the police to police themselves. And that's what it's going to depend on. Officers at the scene stopping a peer from doing something, a cooler head
Yeah,
prevailing.
well, it's been 100 years or more where that's been the status quo in police departments, that police officers do not rat out other officers. There's a code of silence there, and that's a deep core value of the police subculture. Police officers that are young recruits are socialized into a system where they're often tested to see if they're going to be trustworthy, which ironically is not trustworthy. It's the opposite of that. It's whether they're willing to cover things up and toe the line. But law enforcement is exempt from law enforcement as a general rule. Nobody polices the police.
I feel that in Pennsylvania we have a law that if you commit a crime, and if I commit a crime and you walking with me, you will get charged as if you committed a crime too. That's why they have first and second degree murder and conspiracy, right? And that's why we have 658 people right now in Pennsylvania serving life. They never kill no one, but they were with someone or they picked up someone after they committed a crime, right? And I think the same should apply to police officers. If you are a police officer and your partner, and you know your partner is breaking the law and is bringing harm, they could potentially take somebody's life. You don't stop it, you should be charged with murder too. Period. And what we seen, like you said, in the George Floyd case, the person that did the murder was the superior officer. So how do we expect that two rookie officers going against a superior officer? But that needs to stop. I say, me personally, there should be a law that if you kill somebody and we find out that it wasn't justified, every cop that was at that scene while you was committing that murder should be charged. And that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, well, it's a complicated issue, and we've got 50 states in the District of Columbia that have their own laws, and we work under the the guidance of the laws of the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of deadly force. But I think you make a valid point. But the core values of the police subculture are it's a socialization process. It's an us versus them mentality, and there's racism at the core of that. I don't know that there are any quick fixes.
So what? To the people out there, I always tell the people, because in this show we try to educate the people, to listen and pay attention to what you're saying, because a lot of information is being kept from them. A lot of people don't know that over 1,000 shootings occurred. Yearly we see one or two that get the attention of the media, and we think, oh, that was it. That was only it. But no, there's more cases that we don't even hear about in the media. We probably won't even hear about.
Yeah.
So I suggest that the people that's listening, do your research. Listen, rewind this tape and listen to it again, because we giving you information that you're not gonna get nowhere else. And I truly, from the bottom of my heart, I really thank you for educating us on this information, because a lot of people are tapping in and listening, and I know this information could potentially change somebody's life. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
I have a question, Phil. Has any police agencies reached out to you, interested in your research findings, or
Yeah.
offered?
So when Kathy Lanier was the police chief at the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., I had a lot of contact with her office. They often contacted me to talk about my data, talk about issues of concern to them. More recently, I've was retained by the state of Illinois to provide in-service training to police chiefs across the state of Illinois, and started that last fall. Went out and put on a day-long workshop, if you will, or class to about 40 police chiefs from across the state of Illinois. Interesting opportunity in that it was designed by the state. They knew it was going to be painful to sit and listen to me talk all day, but they wanted these police chiefs to hear the data, to recognize some of these things that are real issues that were not within their comfort zone, things they didn't want to talk about. But it was a very receptive audience, and I'm hoping that they're going to have me back, and I hope that extends to other states. I have been retained as a consultant by prosecutors' offices in a few places across the country, asking for assistance with specific cases, and some instances asking for data as they make charging decisions and some of their strategy decisions, wanting to know how some of these other cases have gone. So that's been interesting, and that's all been a big change, because up until 6 years ago or so, I certainly didn't have a whole lot of contact from law enforcement agencies, and it's one of the reasons why I do like to stress that a purpose of my research is to improve policing. The other purpose is to inform the public, and those go hand in hand together. For some reason, some people, especially some people in law enforcement, seem to think that my work is anti-law enforcement. Some have gone to suggest it shouldn't be allowed, which I find an interesting idea. But more and more people in law enforcement are receptive, to looking at our data and some of our research findings. And we've worked hard to try to make some of our research findings available in products that we disseminate outside of peer-reviewed journal articles, to try to reach, so a podcast, for example, one-sheet research briefs, very short articles in Police Chief Magazine, trying to reach them in ways that might be different than, just through peer-reviewed journal articles that nobody typically reads, because their eyes glaze over when they look at tables of regression models.
Right.
I have a question.
I think it's clear. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Suave. Go ahead.
I have a question. I'm interested to know, have you done any study cops that engage in bad behavior and suicide?
Suicide of the officers?
Yes, after they've been investigated or
yeah, no, we we had an incident of 5 years ago or so where an officer was arrested, let's say 3 times within a few weeks, and I just made the offhanded comment to one of my research assistants. This guy seems to be at risk. I hope somebody's getting him help. That's all I said. And about 2 days later, the same research assistant came back to me with some paperwork to show me an article that the officer had killed himself. And she said, "Why didn't you do something about it?" And I said, "Well, let's sit down and talk about that." I said, "You got to remember, we're working in a research lab environment in a university. We're not clinicians. We're not service providers. But it is troubling because if I recognized and you recognized that this was somebody whose life was unraveling, that they clearly needed mental health treatment, they needed supports, that they were probably feeling very isolated, and that the walls were closing in around them. If I recognized that and recognized that this was somebody who was at risk of harming themselves, there's a greater question as to why the hell did anybody else do anything about it who actually knew the individual, who was in a position where they could help. So it's a real thing. We see it every year where we have officers who are actually charged with crimes who kill themselves. And I think it goes to some of the underlying, mental health problems and some of the stresses that police officers have.
Is there a percentage on that? Officers that get charged and get in trouble and just commit suicide or try to harm
No,
themselves?
it's in terms of my data, it's a fairly small number, but in terms of police officers who commit suicide, it's actually alarming in terms of the numbers there, and it's been higher in recent years, I'm told, than in the past. So it's something that police officers don't like to reach out and avail themselves of employee assistance programs and to see mental health service providers. They're afraid that it'll get back to their employer and that their gun and their badge will be taken away and that they'll lose their job. And it's just part of that macho, police officer self-image. So it's a problem, but it's a real problem.
We should definitely recognize the fact that your goal here is not to demonize the police, but to improve.
No, not at all. Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I keep having to remind myself at times. One of the things I'll do is I'll sit down with the research assistants. We have a weekly staff meeting, and occasionally we'll just talk about, wow, that was a really rough week because we deal with some things that are just horrific in terms of the types of data we deal with, the types of narratives, some of the evidence that we deal with, some of the court records, really, really upsetting. But yeah, the goal here is to improve policing. And even so many years into this work, in many ways, my research is still exploratory. We're still learning about different aspects of police crime. I'll give you one example. Realized about almost a decade ago now that prior research would suggest that if police officers are going to get in trouble, if they're going to be bad cops, that's going to come up in the first few years on the job, maybe 3 years in, maybe 5 years at the most. But at that point, they're either going to wash out, they're going to be identified as a bad cop, a problem officer, or they're going to calm down and they're going to write it out. Police departments still have for sworn officers defined pension plans. Many places they can retire after 20, 25, 30 years, write it out to their pension. The retirement. Well, my research shows, and it still shows this, we've seen this pattern since I first identified it a decade ago, close to 20%, more than 17% of the arrest cases where an officer is arrested involve an officer who's within 3 years of retirement eligibility. So we see when they get arrested. So we see these bumps at 18 to 20 years of service, 23 to 25 years of service, 28 to 30, and even 33 to 35 years of service. We see these bumps. So there's something about that transition to civilian life after being a sworn officer for many years, the transition to retirement for police officers that they're not, that some officers are not well equipped for, that the idea that they give up their badge, that they don't have the same arrest powers, that they don't have the same authority, the same power, seems to be so troubling for some officers that they just completely fall apart and unravel. And we see this with all types of crime. It's not just financial crimes. It's not just alcohol-related crimes. It's everything imaginable. It's really troubling. I don't know if there's such a high level of cynicism late in an officer's career. What is it? But there's something about that pre-retirement stage that agencies are not doing a good job at providing the supports that some of their officers need as they transition to the next phase of their life when they're no longer going to be working as a police officer.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. I think we're almost out of time. You have any final comments there, Suave?
Yeah, I just want to thank him for coming on the show and really not educated me, but the public and our listeners, because I think that a lot of time we buy into what we see in the news, and that's the information we get when it's really not the whole story. And I just want to make it clear to the people out there, we not trying to demonize the police. We know that there are some good officers out there that's trying to do their job. My brother's a police officer. I got family members that's police officer, but at the same time, I'm in the neighborhood. I have a responsibility to bring data and accurate information to our listeners. And I think that what we got today was accurate information on police shootings that you probably not gonna get nowhere else. So I thank you, Doc, for reaching out, and everybody that's been listening to the show.
Mhm. All right, Phil, it's good to see you again. Thanks
Great. Thanks,
for
Brian.
thanks for coming. Appreciate you having me as a guest. Good
Anytime.
luck with your
So,
good luck for your future research.
all right. Well, thank you. Stay in touch.
All right, I will.
All
Thank
right,
you.
take care.
Thanks. Thanks again, folks. You've been listening to Justice Conversations with Brian O'Neill, Luis Suave Gonzalez. We are sponsored by Westchester University. Our music is by Moby, and I think we have a guest coming up next week. You know who
Now
it
we
is?
have a guest coming up Saturday. His
Yes.
name is Donnell Drinks.
Oh,
and he's
darn
gonna be
nice.
talk-
Excellent.
And he's going to be talking about voters registration
Okay, excellent. All right.
this Saturday, 1
All
o'clock.
right. All right. And thank you, Dylan, our engineer.